Good morning, survivors. One of you wrote to me and asked, how does society get back to caring and loving each other? Where is all the humanity? Humanity was in all caps, and I feel like we should take a seat for this. And I will let you know that I will get my nipples involved in tackling this topic. A bigger, comfy rocking chair seemed necessary for this because before we get into the how, we need to have a solid starting point in reality. And if we're being real, the question itself is rather naive. Getting back to a time where people were loving and caring implies that this time existed in reality, not in Disney movies or people's idealistic imagination. Disney has really distorted the expectations of this generation and a lot of similar mediums that the reality is humans never really got along. There's nothing in our history that shows that this actually existed. And that's why it's important to understand human nature because, yes, the world seems potentially worse for some people, but we did make a lot of improvements and we just didn't know of all the bad things that were happening before. Ignorance is bliss because we didn't have these devices. We are all connected to the rest of the world and we could remain ignorant and naive. But there is a lot of dangers behind naivety and ignorance. As someone who comes from a post-communist environment, the idea of communism is naive, and that naivety has resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people. And even though people still are seduced by that ideal, and the reason why communism doesn't work, or the reason why it never existed a time where everyone's loving and caring of each other, it's human nature. And that's the part that we should acknowledge. Humans are opportunistic scavengers. That was our place in the food chain before we developed technology. We were on par with hyenas. And this very tribal, social creatures that individually we are very weak, but as a unit, we can achieve quite extraordinary things. And really, the problem humanity had for about 200,000 years is that we never were able to go past our tribal numbers. We don't have the cognitive abilities to connect with more than 50 or 150 people maximum to actually be loving and caring and work together and share resources. And the only thing that has changed that, it's fantasy. The introduction of fantasy is what created human society. And by fantasy, I mean things that don't actually exist, but we share a common belief, and based on that common belief, we are able to share resources and work together towards achieving that common goal or that ideal fantasy. And those fantasies include religion, ideologies, countries, money. All of these things are technically imaginary that people choose to believe in, and therefore they don't need to connect with each individuals, and they're able to share resources and work together based on that common fantasy. So now it gets us to the question of, do we want world peace or do we want diversity? A lot of the conversations of today have been around the value of diversity, and it is obviously very valuable. But the implication of diversity means that people would not have a common fantasy. Different belief systems, different cultures will imply different goals, and therefore, although we can enforce them using force to work together, it never works over a long period of time. One thing about the mammalian brain, which we also have, is that you can get them to submit using punishment or entrapment. But once you do that, they will only do the bare minimum to avoid punishment. And there is a threshold where they just don't care anymore and go all out, where the dairy cow starts attacking the farmer, the dog that's been chained up goes rabid and tries to bite everyone, people start a revolution, people, you know, cheat or do things within their relationships because they want a way out, and the sense of self preservation is no longer the priority. And in order for us to really try to achieve a sense of love and care, even the idea of communism, that should be applied in our families. And, socialism is for our group of friends, and libertarianism is for our community, and capitalism is with the rest of the world. Because unless we decide that we all have the same fantasy and we erase the individual sense that humans have, which again goes against nature, since that also implies that we become ants, we become bees and other insects mostly that are completely driven by this instincts to work as a unit. But since we put a lot of emphasis on the human individual and diversity, especially diversity of thought, something that I value a lot, I have a realistic expectation of what to see out there in the world, that people won't be able to truly come together as one until some disaster or they want to. And that's really where the nipples come in. It was a bit of a joke, but nipples are the example of evolution in nature. The reason why I, as a male, have nipples is because it was not necessary to get rid of them. It didn't stop men from surviving or affected their ability to, reproduce and survive. Therefore, there was no need to inconvenience and do all the work in order to get rid of them. And that's really the reality of nature. Nature doesn't evolve to an ideal, nature evolves to a good enough. And that's the same with humans. Until there is a necessity, and that's why most long term memory formation happens under two circumstances: genuine interest or trauma. And that's why the necessity element. We've seen people come together, be loving and caring during natural disasters because we need to. It's a necessity for our survival. But past that, we need to want it. And if we have this emphasis, and it's been proven by a simple question, we're asked, do you think feelings come first and then actions, or actions come first and then feelings follow? And about 85% out of thousands of replies have been around feelings coming first. Now, think about feelings, they are a subjective, individual experience to things. So, with the mindset that how we feel about things is what is going to inform the actions, and not that we can create a feeling by taking conscious actions, the likelihood of everyone coming together and agreeing when everyone has such an emphasis on individuality is highly unlikely. And I think the same part of human nature that makes people pursue their best interests can also be used to change the world for the better. And the way to do that is by being the change we want to see in the world. I think the thought of changing the world is, I think, a way to just avoid taking the small necessary actions to change yourself and make changes in your family, in your community, because that is how we can change the world, leading by example, because people will pursue their best interest. If you are loving and caring and creating an environment that is thriving based on those values, people will be attracted based on their own interests to also adapt to that environment and try to emulate it. And really, that's what I think the realistic possibility of changing the world is, by making these changes in ourselves and making these changes in our circle of influence, the people around us, and keeping people accountable, the difference between being nice and being kind, because niceness is about ourselves, is about our own safety, about how we want to be perceived. And kindness is not always nice, but kindness looks at what is a good outcome in the future for all of us. And with more and more emphasis on niceness, which is the trait of domesticated animals, if being honest, is that the trade-off for niceness is self-reliance. Nice animals, aka domesticated ones, they need someone to protect them. They need someone to give them food. They rely on someone else to be responsible for them. And in order for someone to be responsible for you, they need to have a degree of control over you. And that's where trying to just say, be nice to each other, makes us ask the question, what is the price of world peace? Because we know that you can't get people to agree on simple things. What's better, pancakes or waffles, for example, right? So making people agree on going against their natural instincts of this opportunity scavengers and to follow their best interest and to compete with each other, because that's where progress comes from. By putting this, we all equal and we all are loving and caring for each other, we know that at work, there's some people who don't really work at the same level as other people. And if given the opportunity, they will slack even more. So the way to impose this equal outcomes is by using fear or force. So the idea of world peace, it is a nice idea to think about, but it is also a scary idea, because it will require someone enforcing that using force, and more often than not, violence. That's why I even gave the example of communism. It starts as a good idea, and eventually it seems to only turn out in a totalitarian, authoritarian regime that oppresses and abuses people, because people who have power and are human, they will abuse it or try to protect it. We see it in animals. They will protect their resources when resources are scarce. And that is the reality of the world around us. Resources are scarce. And that's why, rather than making ourselves be miserable by looking at the world and asking ourselves, why is not everyone getting along? That question is naive or coming from a place of great privilege, where taking all of your privileges away, your very human instincts will kick in and you might not be as nice. So that's why I think the realistic approach towards slowly developing human consciousness is to do it in ourselves and really help our circle of influence to do so and lead by example, knowing that the same negative traits or people pursuing their best interest can also be used for good if we can show people that this actually works and it's not just nice words that we say in that when put in practice it seems to lead to a lot of suffering, because that is where we put ourselves into this regression of humanity where everyone thinks and acts for themselves, and this ideal of us loving and caring for each other flies out the window. Something to think about. Protect your peace.